Okay, welcome everybody to today's Cardiovascular CMR Journal Club. I'm Matthias Friedrich, and I'm broadcasting today from Montreal. Today it will be about a very complex topic, yet clinically potentially relevant, and we're talking about myocardial strain. I'm still not sure whether Philipp is on the call. If so, just send me a text or just unmute yourself and indicate that you're there. I will, in fact, start first with this paper. And apologies from Bernhard Gerber. He would have loved to be here, but he unfortunately has to attend an important meeting. So I will go through that paper basically as an introduction to the other paper. This one is a very nice review published this year in the European Heart Journal Cardiovascular Imaging, and it's reviewing the current status of myocardial strain imaging. And it's called Myocardial Strain Imaging, Review of General Principles, Validation, and Sources of Discrepancies. So in general, question is, what is strain? And strain is a marker for function of contractile function when used in the myocardium, and it basically is a marker for the deformation of tissue. So why is that important? Usually function is assessed by ejection fraction, and that can be done with 2D methods or 3D methods, can be done with several imaging methods. So you measure volume or a marker for the volume, the diastole and systole, for example, and then you calculate the relative output. So that's typically used in most of the clinical trials. However, the ejection fraction has its limitations. First of all, of course, it doesn't give any information on regional function, but also it has its limitation because it's not really very quantitative. So what you're getting is a fraction, but not the absolute volume, the stroke volume, which is important when you talk, for example, about forward heart failure. So that's why ejection fraction sometimes doesn't give the entire information. So you can have a patient with an ejection fraction of 75%, so almost supranormal, and still dying from heart failure if there's a stiff ventricle that is small, and so the stroke volume is so small. So that's why strain imaging may play a role here. So there are three different directions a strain can be assessed. So there's deformation in any of these orthogonal planes. So that's longitudinal along the anatomical heart axis. The circumferential, so that's a measure of the rotational motion. And then the radial strain is the inward motion. And it has been used already by Doppler for a while now, and it has been shown in several papers, also more recently than CMR papers, that strain imaging can be clinically helpful and even provide some additional prognostic value over and above the ejection fraction. So how does that work? In order to measure deformation, you somehow have to have information about the spatial point, the position of a point in the myocardium, and then track how it is moving over the contraction. So you somehow have to have information on the position of a pixel in space, and then how it deforms. So one way of doing that, and that was the first in MR, now we'll focus mostly on MR, is CMR tagging. But before that, I wanted to point to this figure here. Hope you can all see that. So this is the workflow you need for any strain. So you need to identify and accurately identify end systole and diastole. And then you need to define the region of interest in the myocardium that you want to specifically assess. So that could be global, but also regional. And then you have to segment that, and that's the term that is used for clearly identifying the anatomy, but then also tracking it over time. And then you have defined the myocardium during all these phases, and then you need to have a marker for tracking that tissue. And there are two basic approaches. One is you just use mere optics. So that is, these are irregularities in the image or a gradient or whatever. So that's basically an optical flow approach. And the other one is the elastic registration. So that's based on a model. So if the contour of the myocardium goes from A to B and changes its shape like this, then each of these pixels must have behaved like Z. So that is the basic approach of these two different techniques. And so the one using the optical one that has been around for quite a while is tagging. So tagging uses, and here's an example for that here. So it uses a physically imprinted pattern on the myocardium that is using these small saturation pulses at the beginning of diastole, and then tracking the deformation of these little squares that result from that. So that's tagging. Then mainly used in echo is speckle tracking. So that's basically using the irregularities of the tissue as a marker. So that's speckle tracking. You track these speckles. And then you have, which is called here, feature tracking. So there's a method out there published that uses the deformation in normal cine SSFP images, but there's actually a second model out there, and that's why I'm briefly putting up this paper. So that is not mentioned in the review, but this has been another model, and here you, in the figure you'll see how this technically works. So you have your excuse me, whoever is not muted, please mute yourself. So that we don't hear the noise. Thank you. So that in systole and diastole, landmarks, anatomical landmarks are used based on the contours, and then using the assumption that the heart itself, the myocardium, cannot be compressed significantly, the shape has to go from this to this, and so these are the three different examples or various examples on how you can assess that. So it's the radial expansion is here. Here's the radial contraction, and accordingly the radial expansion and the circumferential twisting. So you can track that using this model, and there are complicated formulas that can be used. So this is something that is actually, this is the method that has been used in the paper we're going to discuss soon. That's why I'm bringing that up. So these are the basic approaches. So each of these techniques, so tagging, speckle tracking, and feature tracking, or let's call it tissue tracking because it's not really feature tracking, they have their advantages and disadvantages. And unfortunately, because of various limitations of these techniques, the comparison between them has been quite difficult at times. So with in a nutshell, so this is this grid imaging. A problem of that is that it takes some time to imprint the tag, so you lose some initial, you lose some time initially, and that creates, let me see what I can find out here. Here, so this is when the tagging, you lose the first part, so the resulting strain is underestimated. So that's one limitation of tagging. Another limitation is that these tags, of course, the spatial resolution is relatively limited. So in thin walls, you may have only one of these squares, and the thickness of these little saturation pulses, or the resulting signal intensity drop, is also basically relatively limiting in its way. HARP has also, that's the method that has been used to evaluate these, has been shown to be pretty variable and also time consuming, so that it has stayed actually as a tool mainly for research and not so much for clinical application. So that's the tagging, and it feels like the tagging is a little bit on its way out. So the other methods that we have, that is speckle tracking. Now in echocardiography, Speckle tracking has also several limitations. In table 1, you can see that, and you can download the paper to go into more detail. It's a problem of the positioning, because if you do not have the right plane, and in echo it's sometimes difficult to control for that, then your values are not necessarily accurate. It's also a problem of the reproducibility. So if you just change your plane a little bit without really seeing that and without having that detailed control, you also may have issues. So and because of these reasons, Speckle tracking also has not been very good for circumferential strain imaging. However, circumferential strain imaging is important because it mainly gives the rotational motion that is provided by the inner layer, the subendocardial layer, which is the most important when it comes to coronary artery disease. So that's why circumferential strain and longitudinal strain are more important than others. The longitudinal strain is more a marker for the stiffness of the ventricle in general, so that's why it's particularly altered in amyloid disease and in all hypertrophic diseases. Whereas circumferential strain is probably the best when it comes to assessing inducible wall motion abnormalities during stress, for example. So, so having said that, we're coming to the last one, that is the so-called feature tracking or tissue tracking. Here, the current limitation is that these models that are used are a bit variable, so the reproducibility between techniques is an issue. And also it's a problem of the temporal resolution. So if I only have, let's say, 20 to 25 frames per second, that is already pretty good for MR or standard. You can still see that it's not as accurate as using 80 frames per second. So the temporal resolution is the limitation of most of the techniques, because echo has a better temporal resolution but has these issues with the plane and with the positioning of the plane. So in this, so this figure here, figure 3, summarizes the differences between various, or gives examples for difference between different vendors. So here's the late gadolinium enhancement, 2D Speckle tracking, then feature tracking, tagging, and 3D Speckle tracking. And you see, if you compare it, they come to really quite different results, both in terms of the regional distribution, but also in terms of the quantification. And here, this is for the longitudinal strain, and here you can see the circumferential strain. Also, you see some variations here. So we have an issue of inter-vendor reproducibility of these data, and that's currently a significant limitation. And in ECHO, actually, a consortium has been formed to try to tackle that, to identify ways to standardize that. But this is quite a difficult undertaking. So looking at the factors why the variability may be an issue, it may be difficult to deal with that, at least for the foreseeable future. The main issues are as follows. It's the quality of the acquisition process, so how good are the images in the first place. Then, as already mentioned, the spatial and the temporal resolution. Then for tagging, specifically the delay, so you don't really start at diastole, but a little bit later, 30 milliseconds later. Then, of course, the segmentation misalignment, so between different methods, you may come to different results. Then the software may have, so these are basic problems. Then the software users may use different algorithms to smooth the images, to identify certain landmarks, and the actual size of the regional identifiable smallest voxel, and some softwares go more for subendocardial, others more go for the mid-ventricular or mid neural layer. So we have a lot of software factors, and then there is also the operator. Depending on the experience of the operator, the manual contours may look different. That depends also on the windowing of the screen. A lot of the contouring is now automated, and that certainly helps. But of course, we know that at least at this point in time, machine learning algorithms, while they can contour ventricles automatically, they do not necessarily do that always perfectly. So there are a couple of aspects here. You see the variability for the global longitudinal strain, depending on where you put your contours, and there are sometimes different formulas also being used. So long story short, we have a lot of variability that is caused by the imaging approach itself, the software, and the reader. Validation studies have been out there, but what do you use as a gold standard? So this is a very difficult topic. Sonomicrometry, microsonography may be used and has been actually used. So this is one way to analyze that in vitro and in vivo. In vitro, I find a very elegant method is to use a computer, basically synthetic images. But there are just a few reports out there, and we have to wait for more data. So the paper also here summarizes a couple of the clinical, quote-unquote, validation trials. But you see a lot of them have used CMR tagging as a reference, which itself is, of course, subject to limitations. And here you see in figure 8, you see how variable the normal values that have been published are for the different methods. So if you just take DENSE and SENC, those are probably the most, theoretically, the most accurate, because it's displacement and strain encoded data that are being used. So we get the information from the pixel itself and do not use calculations or models or observed displacement. But here you can see the longitudinal strain varies significantly between the two. And here also for the circumferential strain, there's also a significant difference. Whereas for the radial strain, there is not, but you see the confidence interval is really wide. So long story short, strain imaging at this point in time is a difficult business. We're probably not at a point where you can say, yeah, we can use it clinically and for follow-ups or so. From what I'm basically monitoring in the field, all the different approaches, echo, MR, different softwares, they are still all working on trying to understand where are sources of limitations, or where can sources of limitations be controlled, or how can things be standardized. So that is the reason why I think some of these papers will be important that are coming out. And one of them was now published a few weeks ago in Clinical Research in Cardiology. And the paper is called Biventricular Myocardial Strain Analysis using CMR feature tracking. Although since it's the method that has been published by Vistoke and co-workers, it's actually not feature tracking because there are no features, and this is just basically deformation tracking, or the term was coined tissue tracking, because you actually look at the entire tissue as such and not at certain features. But anyhow, so biventricular myocardial strain analysis using CMR in patients with distinct types of right ventricular diseases, comparing arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy, right ventricular outflow-tract tachycardia, and Brugada syndrome. So this is going after a clinically important problem. We have right ventricular disease that may cause arrhythmia. In some, this is more benign, like in RVOT tachycardia, whereas in others, like in ARVC or Brugada syndrome, they can be fatal even at a young age. And this group from Münster in Germany, a radiology department, have looked at that. And now I'm asking, because unfortunately the confirmation or the reminder email didn't go out, Do we have someone from Münster? So is Dr. Hermann around? If so, then unmute yourself. Okay, that's what I had already thought. So, so we'll go through that paper ourselves. So, what they did in this paper, they used first of all, they used patients. So this is an in vivo clinical study. A total of 65 patients, of whom 16 had ARVC, 26 had RVOT tachycardia, and 9 had a Brugada syndrome. Brugada syndrome, for those who are not deep into cardiology, that's an arrhythmic disease of many of the right ventricle that is assumed to be more an ion channel disease, but it also comes with certain morphological abnormalities. So what the authors did, they performed an cardiac MR at 1.5 Tesla using a standard machine. They used balanced SSFP, so standard cine images in a short axis stack and in an axial stack. So there is always the debate, what's the best orientation for the right ventricle? Is it short axis strictly along the anatomical axis of the heart, but of the left ventricle, or an axial view? There are some arguments, but I will not go too deep into that. So they also performed a 4-chamber view, and then used all these images then to analyze and quantify the strain. So they used this method that I showed here before by Bistoge et al., where you basically draw the contours. The system will use these contours and the deformation then to calculate the strain. So that's what they did. So if you zoom in, you can see that the green contour in the right ventricle indicates the subepicardial, and the red the subendocardial layer. So I already want to point out, so here you can also already see some of the limitations here. I think there was another, but maybe not. That the contours here are of course subject to let's say observer bias. So you could draw the contours also a little bit more subendocardial here. The right ventricle is also pretty trabeculated. So in order to assess strain, you have to somehow make a guess where you knock off or where you cut off the trabecles. And of course, the strain of the right ventricle, if you're really meticulous, we have to assume that the trabecles also play their role here. So this is certainly a limitation of the technique. But anyhow, so they analyzed the data in a blinded fashion. And what they found, and in fact, I will go over that and we'll skip the tables so you can look that up, but it's a bit difficult to explain that. So I go through just to the figures themselves. So what they found is that if you look at the longitudinal strain, that ARVC has the worst. So because the less negative, the less strain you have. So ARVC is clearly sticking out and is statistically significantly different from others. One might also argue, yeah, because ARVC is defined by the criteria they used, the 2010 Marcus criteria, is defined by a reduced right ventricular contraction. So no wonder that your long axis longitudinal strain is reduced. But anyhow, so this is the longitudinal strain, which is probably the more reliable of all of them, shows a clear distinction from ARVC to all others, which makes sense because in RVOT, typically you have do not have a lot of morphological abnormalities, as the same with Brugada syndrome. These are only subtle, and in healthy volunteers, you still have variation, but not necessarily a lot. So looking at the radial strain, you see that there all the diseases show some a difference when compared to healthy volunteers. So that's not specific for ARVC, for example, or for the others. So it's not that you can use the radio strain to differentiate between them. And I also think the radio strain so far probably has the biggest problems when it comes to clinical application. And here's the endocardial radio strain between ARVC and RVOT that was different. So this is more the basal one. So the endocardial was about mid layer. So here you see a difference, but you see also that there's a huge variability of the results. So moving on to the longitudinal strain, of course, the ejection strain. So it's clear that those with reduced ejection fraction and RVC, that they have also more abnormally low longitudinal strain. And here with Brugada syndrome, this is what I found interesting, that the medial radial strain was different between healthy volunteers and Brugada syndrome. I would like to have that verified because Brugada syndrome has some functional abnormalities, but they are not necessarily focused on the medial RV segments. And then when it comes to receiver-operated curves, to differentiate RVOT tachycardia from ARVC and also healthy from Brugada and healthy from ARVC, we see that ejection fraction that's in gray actually performs very well between RVC and RVT tachycardia. No wonder, because ejection fraction is a marker, or is one of the criteria that is used to make the diagnosis of the ARVC. So, but the others, the strain values, the radial strain and the longitudinal strain are still performing okay. And then compared with healthy people, Brugada syndrome, ejection fraction again is a good one, whereas here versus healthy volunteers versus ARVC, you see that the the radial strain actually in this example, and the longitudinal strain outperform the ejection fraction big time. So that's somewhat surprising. So it may be that if you go against healthy volunteers, that ARVC maybe can, but in that case, the strain values have a certain role. So here are some of the blind outcome analyses where you see that there is quite some variability, which is also between observers. And so it's, of course, it's pretty clear that there's a lot of subjective assessment here. So what is the bottom line of this paper? I think it is a little bit too early to say, yeah, let's use strain imaging for the right ventricle. I think we need some we need a confirmation of these data. We also need to have a better understanding on what's going on in the wall of the right ventricle as compared to the left. Is it really the compact wall we can use, or do we have to somehow acknowledge the trabecus, which would be pretty hard with most of the strain models? So to me, this is a preliminary state we're in here. We also need the software vendors to try their best to standardize that, to provide more validation using best in vitro data or synthetic MR images. And so to me, this paper only indicates that once we think we know how to use, and we know whether we can really use strain imaging, then strain may actually have a role in differentiating right ventricular cardiomyopathy from normal right ventricles, or from right ventricular diseases without significant wall motion abnormality. So that's what I had to say. So are there any questions or comments? So feel free to either unmute yourself and just speak up, or send or type your question or your comment into the group chat. There's a window in Zoom that allows for chatting. If I may ask, is anybody using strain clinically? So whoever's using strain clinically, just put a yes or a plus into the chat, because it will be interesting whether people are using that. So in our institution here, I use it rarely, or more of interest, but not yet for clinical decision making. But I wonder whether there's anybody out there who's already doing that. Yeah, no, it is. Yeah, maybe one. Yeah, okay. So so there's one question. Yeah, so one is it right? So they also only using it in research, but not in a clinical workflow. I think that's also appropriate. There's one question: how can we reduce and improve the inter-observer variability in strain CMR? I think that's a very interesting and a good question. I think really in reducing the inter-observer variability is almost futile. Why? Because we're dealing with various levels of experience and understanding what to not include into the contours. I think what we will have to do is we will have to wait for machine learning based contouring that is good enough that it can deal with all these intricacies and problems of the right ventricle. I don't see that right now. I think with the left ventricle, we're almost there. But even with the left ventricle, we need to train systems with more data so that we can get really reliable contours. And even if there is a mistake somewhere in the contours, it will hopefully be a systematic error, so that the reproducibility would be still good, and also the comparison between software. So what we need is a huge data banks with contours that are used by all the different software providers to generate their machine learning based algorithms. So that would be mine. So there is another comment. As shown, there are relatively large differences between the techniques. If we would start a new study on the effects of, for instance, PCI on tissue tracking or echo speckle tracking. So my recommendation, first of all, if it's a PCI, that's clearly addressing an ischemic problem, so that should be then the circumferential strain more than anything else. And for the circumferential, I would clearly go for CMR, and I would probably not use tagging, but either one of the newer strain encoding techniques, SENC, or DENSE, or the tissue tracking method that I showed here from Bistoke et al. If you need more information on that, send me an email. I can give you more. So I would clearly not go for tagging, not go for speckle tracking, because while speckle tracking is looking more for the circumferential, but the reproducibility, especially if you do it before and after PCI, I don't think that would be good enough. So if there are no other questions, I want to thank you for the feedback and the questions, and I hope you found that interesting. So next week, next week is no journal club, but in 2 weeks, and we will announce the paper during this week, because we want to wait for the confirmation of the author to present the paper. And so until then, I wish you all the best, and wherever you are, a good evening or a good day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.